Let me introduce Stephen. He's on our board of directors, the board of directors of the Canton Land Conservation Trust. He's hiked the entire Blue Trail system in Connecticut. His other experiences include hiking the 100 highest peaks in New England and the 115 4,000 footers in the Northeast. Some of you have seen a presentation by him before. About a year ago, he gave a talk about the hikes in the Blue Blaze system. That presentation can be found on the Land Trust YouTube site. Let me show you how to find it, and then I will, I've shared how to do it in chat, but I will copy it again. I'll start by sharing the screen. So this is the Canton Land Trust. This is the Canton Land Trust page. This is the navigation bar. The last thing up here is YouTube. If you click on this, this brings you to our YouTube site. Home has a few things in here, but click on videos and scroll down and you will see Stephen Shaw's presentation on the Blue Blaze system, which I will now pause. And as I said, I copied it into the chat. I'm going to copy it again. But before I turn it over to Stephen, I will just remind people that after this talk, he plans a hike at Sweetheart Mountain on February 18th, where some of these things can be put into practice in hopefully real winter conditions. So with that, let me stop sharing. Let me pin it so that it's always on Steve, and I will turn it over. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we'll see what happens on February 18th to see if we get some actual snow and ice. So let me start by saying that everyone is different. Is that I tend to run very hot and I sweat a lot, but then I cool down quickly. There are other people that maybe run cold, don't sweat too much. So what I'm going to go over are going to be general guidelines and what I've learned from experience and then learned from others. I've looked at a whole bunch of YouTube videos of other hikers that have gone over winter gear, and I've picked up tidbits and I've done testing because this is a constant test of what works for you, what doesn't work for you at different temperatures and different conditions. The two biggest factors that will keep you warmer and comfortable when you're hiking in the wintertime is moisture control and keeping the cold out. So I'll go over each of those individually. So moisture is obviously you're gonna sweat. If you're going uphill and you're working hard, you're going to sweat. If you're moving very fast, you're likely to sweat. So the most important thing is to be able to get rid of that moisture and get it away from your body, which, yes, it cools you a little bit, but in the long run, it keeps you warmer, because if you have really wet gear, when you do slow down or you do stop for a few minutes, you're going to get cold very fast. So the most important thing there is synthetic and wool materials tend to wick moisture away from your body. So they help get moisture away from you. Whereas cotton will retain moisture. So if you're retaining moisture, one, it's adding weight, and two, it's going to keep you colder or make you colder when you slow down or you stop. And I get it. I was a beginning hiker at a certain point in my career as well. And I started with cotton. But over time, I improved my gear. I tested what worked and what didn't. So I'm not saying go out to a sporting goods store and buy a whole bunch of items. Add pieces as you go along. And over time, you'll get more experience with what gear works for you. And you'll figure out what is good for Connecticut. Now, keep in mind, I do a lot of hiking in the White Mountains and in the Adirondacks. But I have hiked a lot in Connecticut as well. And that's when I was doing the Blue Trail system, was in 2014 to 2016. And that was my first experience with winter hiking. So I I started with subpar gear at that point in time. And if you're not that far from a trailhead, it's not as much of a factor. If you're above tree line, like you are here in the White Mountains, and you're fully exposed, that's a completely different story. So moisture control is very important. Just help to get the sweat out. The next thing is keeping the cold out. Well, keeping the cold out is simple as layering. So for example, I've got long sleeves on here, and if I put on my glove, I can overlap the sleeve over my glove. No more air exposure. That's going to help keep the cold out. When you put your long underwear on, you're going to put your socks likely over your long underwear. So you're going to keep the cold air out that way. And I'll get into more items around the face and the head, because usually that's going to be your biggest exposure area as we keep going. So it's when you're hiking in the wintertime, it's constant temperature control. For example, yesterday I did a very long hike, about 19 miles, and it was in the upper teens to low 20s. For upper gear, and I'll go over these in a few minutes, I just had a smart wool base layer, and I was wearing this fleece hoodie, and I had no jacket on beyond that. And I was completely warm because I was working really hard to go up the mountain, and I was moving fairly fast. I did find, because there was light snow coming down, a little bit of flurries, and the snow that comes off the trees, that my sleeves had gotten so snowed up that they got wet. At one point in time, at the end of the day, when it was starting to get dark and colder, my sleeves actually started to freeze. I could feel them getting hard. So I just picked up my pace and started using my trekking poles, which forced my arms to move, and the freezing went away. Whereas today, I was hiking. I only did 4 miles of snowshoeing. Nobody had broken trail, so I was working fairly hard. Is that I started with a base layer in the fleece, and within a half an hour, I put the fleece into my backpack, and I had just the base layer and no gloves, and I switched from a hat to a buff for my head. But then as I got towards 2,000 feet, I started to get colder, so I put layers back on. So you have to be ready to add layers, remove layers, zip up your jacket, unzip your jacket. And when we get into the hard shell, there's more zippers there. So that's a big factor, is the constant temperature control. So let's get into some of the actual gear. So I'll start at the bottom with the feet. I typically use sock liners. I've upgraded to the Injinji toe separator liners. They've just been very comfortable, and I think I had one blister during the last year. On top of that, I use fit socks. I also have Darn Toughs. These are nice because they actually go over my calves. They're big enough. And those will keep my lower feet and lower leg very warm. For underwear, I use Ex Officio, which again is synthetic. I use these in the summertime as well. And then I've got Smart Wool for long underwear, which I use on top of that. So again, these are the layers, and these will adjust depending on how warm or cold it's going to be in the conditions I'm getting out to. So moving up to the torso. So base layer, I'm using Smart Wool mostly. I do have some Bergeron, which is a local brand up here in New Hampshire. They're very similar, as they're synthetic materials, and they help the sweat to get away from your body. They wick away the sweat. So they use a combination of wool and synthetic to get the best of both worlds. Some people are diehard wool only, some people are synthetic only. You have to figure out what works for you. All right. So moving to the hands. So I will use fleece gloves, but over those, if it gets really cold, I will then use mittens. The reason why I use the mittens is they tend to keep the heat in my hand and also allows me, if I want to put my fingers together inside if I need a warm-up time. So today, like I said, I start with the gloves, fleece. Again, fleece is a synthetic material, wick the moisture away. These also have the e-touch, so I can use my smartphone without taking my gloves off. Very important if it's very cold. Either that or you know how to use the buttons on your phone if you just want to take a couple quick photos and not expose your skin to the cold. So moving on to headgear. So again, smart wool, I've become a fan. So I'll use a good hat. Notice the hat covers my ears for the most part. So that'll keep my head really warm. Now, this morning, I started with a hat, but it got too warm. So I switched to my buff. Nice thing about the buffs is they fold up and pack very small. So if I just need a little bit of coverage, I'll use the buff like this. Now, the nice thing about buffs is they are very, very versatile. So I can pull this down and I can use it around my neck if I need to keep my neck warm. And better yet, if I'm really exposed and it's cold, I can put it over most of my face. So that with a hat and a buff and a hood, that's going to do a lot. Notice the only thing I've exposed is my eyes. And then when you get heavier into that, you can always go heavy duty gear. And usually this is only above tree line. You can use the baklava and you can cover up most of your face. And if you're really exposed, and I'm talking about single digits, high winds, no trees like you would get on top of the Mount Washington, etc. Very important to have goggles. Reason for goggles is your eyeballs will literally freeze. One of my hiking friends that I've gone on a bunch of adventures with, he actually had one of his contact lenses freeze and blow right off of his eye. And he was trying to finish his hike with just one contact in. So it can happen. But you're usually not going to get these kind of conditions in Connecticut. Very few places where you're going to get above tree line and complete exposure. So some of these items are going to be more important if you go up to the White Mountains or to the Adirondacks or someplace else that's above trees, like in Colorado or whatever. So what is next? What's in my back? Oh, I should cover legs. So if it's going to be warm enough, I'll use regular warm hiking pants. And then for my lower legs, I'll use gaiters, which strap underneath your boots. I tend to not use the gaiters very much. I tend to, if it's snowy and sloppy out, I'll use hard shell pants, full length pants. What's nice about these is they have the hard gaiter type material on the inside of your two legs, of lower legs. And the other nice thing about these, again, for temperature control, is they've got zippers down the side. So if I'm getting too warm, I can open up the zipper and let my legs breathe. Again, getting rid of that moisture near my leg. They're also good for, which we'll get to more for food, is there's a one pocket in the pair that I have, which it's important to keep your food as warm as possible. Now for the rest of the top layer, I have, if it gets really windy, or if it might turn to rain, or it might be snowing heavily, I have a hard shell, which the hard shell you can wear over the fleece if you like. It also has a hood. What's nice about the hard shell is it has a big armpit zipper. So if I'm using this, the problem with a hard shell is it's like wearing saran wrap. It will hold and retain a lot of moisture. So it's going to be important to allow as much of that moisture to escape as possible. And then you can also unzip the front. I've had many times where I've had my top layers fully unzipped and I've got the bottom of my backpack unclipped so I can just breathe as much as possible. The puffy jacket, which is my last layer of defense, and I don't actually recommend wearing these unless you're much drier or it's cold enough or when you're stopping. So the puffy, the synthetic insulation, this is really good if it's extremely cold. Now, I keep on learning things as well. So what's interesting is I didn't actually start using the fleece mid layer until this year. That photo that you saw in the invitation email, that was actually a bad setup on my part. That was minus 12 degrees. We're doing the Wildcat Mountains up here in the White Mountains. And I only used my base layer with the puffy with the hard shell over it. Problem is that the puffy will retain a lot of moisture, and then it'll keep the moisture on your base layer as well because it can't get through the puffy very well. So what I really should have done is I should have had a fleece mid layer on top of my base layer and then the hard shell over that. And I should have only used the puffy if I stopped for say 5 or 10 minutes, which I typically never do. That's another way to really keep your heat going is when I stop, I'll stop for maybe 2 or 3 minutes at a time. So I do that training in the summer as well as I just keep moving, because in the wintertime, if you keep moving, it means you keep generating heat. So you're going to stay warmer. That's when you stop. In the summertime, it's great to be able to take a 10, 15, 20-minute break and sit down and have lunch. But in the wintertime, that's when you're going to get really cold. And when you get really cold, it's harder to get warmed back up. So I tend not to stop for very long. What is in my backpack? This is a lot of stuff to go through. Of course, water. I use insulated thermoses. And when I set these up in the morning or the evening before, a lot of times I will put warm or hot water into these. So by the time I'm in the middle of my hike, I still have some warmth to get into my body. I just usually do electrolytes with water. Some people might do soup or might do some other food as part of their thermos. Some people also have the Injinji thermoses, and you could put a sock over them. Now, what's interesting is that water tends to freeze from the top down. So what people will do is they'll put their thermoses upside down, or their water bottles upside down with a sock over them to help the top, because then they'll freeze at the bottom and not at the top when you actually want to drink through it. So that's a good trick. I tend to just go with the thermoses. It's easier. And I don't think I have any socks that are big enough to fit over these. Moving through the pack, wintertime, I always have a whole bunch of hand warmers. So when you pull them out of the package, they're just like this. I think I've used foot warmers maybe once. In a couple minutes when I get to the boots, I'll talk about why. But these hand warmers are great. They'll last for 6 to 8 hours. So if you start to get cold, they're very helpful. The other thing they're helpful for as well is that depending on your phone and the temperature, your phone may freeze and actually turn off. I rely on my phone not just for photos, but for navigation. So I've got AllTrails and Gaia as GPS navigators that I use on my phone. So what I'll do is I'll put a hand warmer in with my phone in the same pocket, and that'll help just enough heat to keep the phone going. The other good use of the hand warmers is put it in the pocket with your food, because it'll help keep the food a little bit warmer, and it's not so brutally cold when you take it out of your pocket, depending on whatever pocket is most convenient for you. Headlamp, always carry one, whether if I think I'm going to be hiking at night or not, you never know. Yesterday's hike, I started at 6 a.m. It was in the dark, and I finished at 5:30 in the dark. So having a headlamp is very helpful. Now, this is a Petzl, which is rechargeable. My friend that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we were on a winter hike last December on the Tri-Pyramids here in the White Mountains. He had a black diamond with batteries. His black diamond failed. It ends up, and we read about this online afterwards, is black diamonds are known for failing when it's too cold using batteries. This is a rechargeable lithium, so it worked better. And so we ended up using my headlamp for the two of us to do water crossings in the middle of the night or at the end of the night. I'm an IT guy. I rely on a battery backup with a small cord. This battery backup will recharge my phone up to 6 times. So I've never had this run out of juice. I've never even had it get below half. So this is very helpful. This also can get too cold. So if you put a hand warmer next to your battery backup, it can be very helpful as well. Let's see, chapstick, very important for your nose as well. I will use this on the end of my nose because if your nose is going to run a lot in the wintertime. So if that's happening, I've found that you're better off to, I put the chapstick on, but I also find to blot my nose, unfortunately, usually on the back of my mitten or on the back of my glove, as opposed to rubbing, because I've had times where the skin is all peeling off because I've rubbed too much. So chapstick is very important. My food, I tend to not eat a lot when I'm hiking, but I've found that for me, gels work. So I do gels. I've used to use Cliff Blocks, and they're great in the summertime. But in the wintertime, shock blocks become bricks. And Cliff Bars also become bricks. A good way to test your food is to put them in the refrigerator or in the freezer for a few hours, and then find out how easy it is to eat or whatever it is that you're testing with. I also have become a fan of Nature's Bakery. These tend not to get too cold. Again, both of these foods are in my pocket. A trash bag, of course, to fit some of my stuff in. Rest of my backpack, Tylenol for me, Advil, and salt tablets. I'm a very salty sweater. So I bring extra salt tablets, which will help to reinvigorate me besides just electrolytes. Rest of my pack, it keeps going. So wintertime, micro spikes. I usually consider spikes as small, medium, and large. These are the micros. They've got smaller teeth on them. They're only about half an inch long. If it's soft conditions in the snow, I don't like micro spikes as much because they tend to clump up under the ball of your feet, and you'll end up with a fist size bunch of slush and ice underneath your foot, and then it's uncomfortable to walk. I tend to move up to the medium size, which they usually call trail crampons or crampons. These are Hill Sounds. These don't clump up as much, though they did a little bit on me yesterday because I had to go through a couple stream crossings and they got wet, and then they attached a bunch of snow. But that's when you just find a rock or a downed tree and just pound your foot against them and get rid of as much of the snow and ice as possible. I bring an extra base layer because if your base layer that you're wearing gets too wet, I've known some hikers or know some hikers that as you're going up the mountain, you're going to be producing the most sweat, is changing your base layer just before you get to the top or just before you get above tree line is a good idea for some people. I haven't done it, but I know other people that do. And then because you know that you're almost at the top and then you're going to be going down. When you're going down, you're not working as hard. You're not going to sweat as much. So changing your base layer at the top or near the top can be very, very helpful to keeping you warm. That way, as you go downhill and you're not working as hard, you won't get as cold. on your conditions. So continuing on with what's in my pack, and I'm not going to open all this up, but I have one of those silver sort of aluminum foil wraps as an emergency. I have Kleenex in here, which doubles as toilet paper. I have some more electrolytes. I have a water filter in case I run out of water. I have matches in a waterproof container. Somewhere in here, I've got a spork because that's next on my list is food. Overnight food if needed. An emergency is I need something to eat the food with. And I also have a pocket knife in here. And last is Leukotape. Leukotape is a medical tape. It's really good. I use it on some of my toes to prevent toenails from pulling, which they will do. And I will also use it if I'm getting a hot spot, which is the precursor to a blister. So this is really good tape. It'll last for multiple days and has saved me from many blisters and many chafing areas. Now I'll get into the items that I only use in an emergency, but I always carry with me. I have an emergency bivy. This is like a mini sleeping bag that you could crawl into. It's big enough to fit a person, but not anything else. You're not going to be able to fit your gear in here. But this is an emergency bivy that will help you retain as much heat as possible. Of course, I've got a first aid kit. Never opened it. Thankfully, I've never had to use it, but it has all the basics. There's like 12 different items in here. Winter, you hope that you never get into a situation where you have to stay overnight, but things happen. So you have to be prepared with an additional meal. So I always bring a dehydrated meal with a boiling pot, and inside the boiling pot, I have a fuel system with a little gas burner. So only bring these in the wintertime in emergency cases. Hopefully I never have to use it. Again, in Connecticut, you're usually never that far from a road or from someplace. Hopefully you're able to get out and self-extract, as they would say. But things do happen. I know a hiker up here that she's hiked the entire Appalachian Trail. She was going for a hike last week near Crawford Notch, a very popular area. Stepped 10 feet out of her car, slipped on ice and broke her ankle. And now she's got multiple screws and she's going to be recovering for the next 6 to 8 months. So you may not even be on trail yet. Things they do happen. One area I want to cover is very important is know what you're getting into. So weather is a huge factor. So understand what weather you're getting into. And sorry, I do have some other gear that's behind me that I keep on forgetting because it's behind me. I use trekking poles, which are very helpful. And my boots, I have Merrell hiking winter boots. These are 200 grams of insulation. These are actually my second pair over the last 7 years. And these are fantastic. Absolutely love them. I've never had my feet get cold in these. They are not waterproof, but they are water resistant. I did step in a stream today because the ice bridge broke and my foot plunged right in. My foot never got wet. And I went in 4 or 5 inches of water. And then, of course, snowshoes, or as we like to call them, clown shoes, because when you're wearing these, you feel like a clown at times, and it's interesting to move your feet. These also have the elevator lift in the back. So if you're doing a lot of uphill, it'll help to save your calves. So back to weather and weather forecasts. Don't try to outrun a storm. If you know that there's a storm coming and they project it's going to hit at 1 p.m., don't try. If you know it's all of a sudden going to be 50, 60 mile an hour winds and going to be really uncomfortable where you are, Mother Nature will always surprise us. And Mother Nature is what we're trying to enjoy, but protect ourselves from. There have been too many people that have thought that they could outrun a storm, and then they're too far out, and the storm acted differently. Weather forecasts are that they're just a guesstimate based on the information they know at the time. One big thing is that it gets colder as you go up elevation. The general rule is it reduces in temperature by 3 to 5 degrees per 1,000 feet. So if you know that you're going to be going up 2,000 feet of elevation, you have to just basically say it's going to be 10 degrees colder there than it is down in the valley. That 10 degrees plus wind chill can make a huge factor of what you wear and how comfortable you are. Two websites that I use to check the weather, because your typical weather app will not tell you what the weather is going to be on a mountaintop, are Mountain Forecast and Open Summit. Mountain Forecast is heavily used, and it'll tell you what they're projecting for the winds, the temperature, and etc. And it'll give you a lot of projections. Now, smaller mountains are not usually listed, but you could probably find a mountain that's closest to it to at least get a general idea. So, for example, if you're doing Bear Mountain in the northwest corner of Connecticut, Bear Mountain's probably going to get listed. Whereas some other mountains around Canton, like Onion Mountain's not going to be listed because it's too small. So those are very helpful. General rule of thumb, always let somebody know where you're going. Let a friend of yours know roughly where you're going, when you're going to plan on finishing. I have two people, my girlfriend and one of my hiking buddies, that always know where I'm going. I also use a spot GPS tracker that's attached to my backpack. So with all of those, they know where I am. If I have signal, I will text them periodically and let them know where I'm at, if I'm doing fine, if I'm running slow, that kind of thing. Have a turnaround time. If you know that you think you're going to get so far in a certain amount of time, it's good to have sort of like a safety turnaround time of say, okay, I need to, regardless of how far I get, you might not reach your goal, but by 2 p.m., you probably want to start heading back. The worst thing you can do is get what they call summit fever, where you keep going even though your mind is telling you you should turn back and the weather is telling you should turn back. That's when people get into trouble. And bail. I have hiked many times where I was trying to get to a peak and I just knew that the conditions were going to slow me down too much and I was going to be getting back much after dark and it wasn't going to be comfortable. There's nothing wrong with making a smart decision and saying today's not the day. The mountain will be here another time and I'll come back later. I've done that a whole bunch of times and that's why I'm still here. There's a lot of people up here in the White Mountains, unfortunately, have not done that and they're not here anymore. All right, food and water. I covered a little bit of food and water before. The biggest thing, you have to figure out what works for you for food. I like the gels because they're still edible even when they get chilled. They don't become a rock solid. Cliff bars, like I said, and shock blocks are great in the summertime when it's nice and warm. They stay nice and soft. But in the wintertime, you're going to break teeth, which is not recommended. And then the water. Water, like I said, I use an insulated water bottle so it stays warm enough. The other thing I do is I camel up. So I will, the day before and that morning, is I will overhydrate. I'll drink a lot of fluids. A lot of times I'll drink a Gatorade as I'm driving to the trailhead after a big breakfast. So I'll have a big breakfast. I'll have a big dinner the night before. That way your body has more fuel to work with. It's an excuse to eat dessert once in a while, which is always fun. Yeah, like I said, test your food in the freezer or refrigerator. Big thing, test your equipment at home. Don't be out someplace where it's 10 degrees and you're cold to start with, and then you're fumbling with how to put on your snowshoes because you've never put them on before, or you're fumbling with micro spikes, which are rubber and they have to fit over your boot. Do that at home. Do some tests at home. Do things like test out taking your gloves off. The other thing I do with to keep my hands warm is, and I did have to do this yesterday, I got cold enough, is I'll put a hand warmer in the palm of my hand, and then I'll slip carefully my mitten over my glove, so that hand warmer is right there. So that hand warmer will help keep all my fingers and thumb nice and warm. So test these things beforehand. And that way you're not fumbling around and you're wasting time, because time will be your enemy when you're trying to stay warm. So, yeah, so put your gear on at home as much as possible, and then put a little bit on in the car while the car is still running and it's warm. That way you just get out of the car and go. So even with a GPS, when I use Gaia and I use AllTrails on my phone, I turn it on my tracking while I'm still in the car. I don't care if it hurts my averages a little bit, because then I've got to go in the back and get my backpack and my poles and things like that. But it's helpful because it keeps me warmer. So that's all I have, Phil, as a fairly quick talk about the gear. And we went over a lot of items here, so I'm sure there are some questions. So I will let you fire off some questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. For just a quick note for others, I've done some very serious winter hiking or winter condition hiking, and I learned a number of new things today. So I'm excited about this.
Good.
But as he said, anybody now can unmute themselves and ask a question. I see Jean unmuted herself. Does she want to ask a question?
Yes, I do. You talked about the Spot GPS tracker.
Yes.
That's separate, obviously, from your phone, assuming your phone has GPS.
Yes, it is separate from my phone. There is a monthly subscription. I'm actually looking to upgrade to the Garmin InReach Mini, okay, which is just a newer version, but they're subscription base. And the Garmin InReach actually lets you do texting via the GPS signal. So even if you have no cell phone coverage, if you're way out there, it can be very helpful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about that, because I sometimes hike alone and, wonder what would happen.
Yeah, so the Spot, because it's GPS, it keeps on working. There with the Spot, you can set it on tracking, and then there's an OK button that you can periodically hit. And what it does is it then, through the GPS signal, will send a text to people that you have pre-set up as contacts for you. So they will get a text to say you're okay. So there's no other messaging you can do through the Spot like that, unless I've got an older one, so the newer one might have more features. But the InReach Mini will allow you to set up to 15 preset text messages. So you use that with your phone through Bluetooth, and you can just say, I'm finishing for the day, I'm on my way out, or I've still got whatever preset messages you wanted to have.
Okay. My second question with that is, you said you attached it to your knapsack. I was surprised you didn't attach it to your body, because if you lose your knapsack, they won't know what
if I lose my backpack, I'm in big trouble. Right now I'm using an Osprey 70 liter because I'm doing some training for a big hike out in the Northwest this July. So I have all my gear in there, and if I were to lose my backpack entirely, then I would be probably in trouble, because I would be losing all of this stuff to keep me warm.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And one important thing that I guess I forgot to add is that what you're used to for fast times in the summer, throw them out the window for winter time. Everything's going to be slower. It all depends on the conditions. And if you're breaking snow through, for example, the first time I snowshoed was in Middletown, Connecticut, and that was back in 2015. We just had 8 to 10 inches of snow. That was the slowest mile I've ever done. I was literally down to a mile an hour. And I was so sweaty and so tired from doing that, that whereas in the summertime, that mile I would have done in 15 to 20 minutes. So what you project for timings in the summer, you have to expect everything to be slower in the wintertime.
Great, good answer. Anybody else have any questions? If not, then I'm going to thank Stephen for a very entertaining talk. This has been recorded. I'm going to figure out how to convert this recording to a YouTube, and we will put it up on our website, because I'm sure there's some things that you'll say, wow, what did he say? And you'll want to go back and see it again. I know I will. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you for everybody that attended.
Sure.